Hey everyone, Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FC Piero DIY. Today we're going to be working on our 99 Carrera 911. Today we're going to be showing you how to replace the engine oil cooler on this 996 behind us. This oil cooler is responsible for, you guessed it, keeping the oil cool in your vehicle. It's an external cooler that sits above the engine, usually on the back half towards the firewall. And over time, the cooler not so much can go bad, but the seals that sandwich the cooler to the engine block go bad. These little guys can turn into hard plastic, brittle, and start leaking. Oftentimes, people will mistake the leak from this oil cooler as a rear main seal leak, as it is located, again, on the back side of the motor, facing, basically you can see it if you look underneath from the transmission. So as oil leaks, it'll start dripping down the block, oftentimes leading you to think you have an RMS seal. So just something to look out for. We're using our Mala Bear kit today. It includes a new oil cooler, seals, hardware, and the hose and a couple clamps. Now, before we get started with this job, let's take a look at the tools we're going to need. And now, onto the tools. To do this oil cooler job, we have a vast array of tools, similar to our air oil separator video if you watched that already. We have a couple different extensions, both in 1/2 inch and 3/8 drives, as well as 1/4 inch. We have sockets ranging all the way from 7 millimeters to 18 millimeters. We have a couple different wrenches. We have a 10, a 13, and a 15 mil. We have 2 torque wrenches that give us different torque values, a couple pliers for hose clamps and just regular miscellaneous, as well as a couple flathead and Phillip head screwdrivers, and our CTA 7 mil flex head with a socket on the end. Some nice to haves are a pick, a magnet tool, good for fishing out bolt or sockets if you drop them in the engine bay, as well as an electric ratchet to speed things up a bit, and an impact for the big 18 millimeter nuts on the bottom of our engine mounts. Something not pictured as well is our floor jack and a piece of wood that's going to be needed to support the engine while we drop the engine about 3 inches to get our hands into the engine cavity. Now that we have all our tools covered, let's get started on this DIY. The first thing we want to do is disconnect the battery. The reason for that is that we're going to be working near the starter, so we want to avoid harming and shocking ourselves as well as damaging the electricals on the vehicle. I'm going to take a 10 millimeter socket on a ratchet and disconnect our 2 terminals. Again, that's a 10 millimeter socket needed to disconnect the 2 terminals. First day on the job. So first, we're going to go ahead and remove our airbox. We're going to unplug our mass airflow sensor by pressing these 2 tabs in. I like to push it into the box and then pull it back out. I'll free that up. From there, I'm going to remove the oil fill tube. This just pops up and out of the way, just like that. Next, I'm going to remove this hose clamp that connects the intake boot to the throttle body. You can use a flathead screwdriver. I'm using an 8 millimeter socket on a ratchet. And then from there, you want to remove the 13 millimeter bolt that holds the whole box to the engine bay. From there, we can go ahead and give the intake boot a gentle tug and separate that. Then we're going to pull the airbox out and remove the mass airflow sensor wire from the little connecting clip that holds it in place. Before we go ahead and drain the coolant out of the vehicle, we're going to go ahead and remove our cap. That way the system can flow a little bit better. I didn't have my Wheaties this morning. What the F, Bobby? You see this cap? Quick tip, obviously, but can't hurt to remind you all, don't do this with the vehicle being hot. You want to make sure you have a stone cold engine before we remove anything related to the coolant tank. And generally when you're working on it, makes life a little bit easier. Now we're underneath the vehicle, we're going to go ahead and drain the coolant. You have your drain plug right here. This should be enough to get the fluid out of the reservoir. Of course, you can also use a baster or a syringe to just evacuate the reservoir. However, we're going to be doing a full extensive flush on this vehicle, so we're just going to drain it from up here. It's going to require a 5 millimeter Allen hex. Oh, yeah. All right. I'm going to go ahead and raise my catch can up just so it doesn't splash all over the place. Now that I've bathed myself in coolant, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our coolant drain plug. You're going to want to make sure you replace it if possible with a new fresh crush washer. We're going to get that threaded in, started by hand. And you want to torque it down to 7 foot-pounds or 10 Newton meters. There we go. Next, we're going to go ahead and drain the engine oil just to avoid making any further spills inside the bay while we're working on this job. So let's go ahead and take an 8mm Allen hex and take off the drain plug. Again, this is an 8mm Allen hex. Break that free. Now we've left most of the oil drain out of the engine, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our drain plug and washer back on. You'll note I'm not putting a new one on just yet. This is temporarily. Stay tuned for a proper oil change video coming soon. All right, now let's head to the hatch side of the engine. We're going to go ahead and remove the belt. To do that, you're going to want to put a 24mm socket or wrench, whatever you have, on this tensioner here. And we're going to compress it. I have a socket on a wrench. Again, that's a 24mm. I'm going to push down on that. I'm just going to slip the belt off. If you haven't done so already, make sure you note the orientation of the belt before you pull it off. There's a bunch of pictures online that you can use. I like to take a picture before I do this. Now we're ready to go ahead and support the engine before we loosen up those two 18mm bolts. So I'm using our floor jack and a piece of wood to jack up against the bottom of the sump. We'll get that set up and then we'll crawl underneath and loosen up our two 18mm. Now that we have our 18mm bolts removed, we have our jack in place. We're going to go ahead and get ready to drop it down a little bit and get this tank out. I'm going to put the cap back on just in case whatever's in here has less of a chance of spilling all over the ground in the car. Now from here, we can go ahead and lower down the engine a couple inches. Let's start with that. That should be more than enough. So to proceed, we're going to go ahead and start by taking off our throttle body. First things first is we're going to remove our throttle cable. This is a 99-year car, so it's got a throttle cable and it's not electric like the newer cars are. So if you're doing this on a 2000, 2001 or newer vehicle, it's just going to be an electrical plug. We're going to actuate the throttle all the way back, and then we can go ahead and pull the end of the cable out and slide it off to the side, and that disconnects that. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove our electrical plug here that connects to the TPS. Similar to the ignition coils, if you saw that video, you want to simply press on that tab until it clicks off and pull the connector out of the way. Now, if you'd like, you can take some painter's tape and label this if you're going to be going further in depth than just this removal. These plugs are kind of all different, so it's going to be a little hard to mix them up, but it can't hurt. You'll probably see us doing that as we proceed. From there, you want to focus on taking out, we have 5 10mm bolts. We're going to remove those. This is just a bracket that helps support it, so we can get this out of the way and work on disconnecting the next plug as well as this hose. Using a 10mm socket and an extension, I'll start with this one right here. And then work my way around the throttle body. You want to do this top right one before you do the top left one, just to give yourself some mobility on this hose, so you don't have to flex it too much. One more thing I failed to mention is you want to unhook the clip that holds the throttle cable in place on the throttle body plate there. I'm going to try using a couple pliers just to push the 2 pins in, and we can push that guy right back. There we go. Flathead. Use the flathead. Now we're going to go ahead and disconnect the sensor. You want to push on this metal tab. It'll disengage it and pull it off. And last, we have this hose that goes to the throttle body. I'm going to use some pliers to undo the clamps and pull that off. Just like that. Pull this hose off. And our throttle body is free. Set this to the side. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove this air oil separator line that goes to the plenum here. There's going to be a ridge portion on the top and the bottom. We're going to go ahead and squeeze on both of them and try to remove it without breaking it. Of course, we're going to be replacing this on this car, so we're not too worried if we do. If you're not replacing this line, be very gentle with these as the plastic becomes brittle over time and you can risk cracking it. There we go. Didn't break it. I just used some pliers to put some even pressure on both of the tabs. Obviously, you saw we were able to do that without breaking anything. Just worth a shot if you're having trouble with it like we did. You just push that off to the side. I'm going to use a 7mm socket on a long extension on a 1/4" ratchet to take off the 4 hose clamps that remove the plenum here. First, what you want to do is you're going to want to go ahead and break the inner ones first, and then twist the plenum to break it free from the connecting boot. And then from there, we'll tighten these 2 back up, and then we'll loosen up the outer ones to break them free from the manifolds. I'll show you what I mean as we go. First, let's tackle the 2 inner ones. Again, 7mm socket to free these up. All right, now that the 2 inner clamps are loose, let's go ahead and break this free by spinning it just like that. Awesome. Now that those are free, we're going to go ahead and tighten them back up. Now we're going to go ahead and loosen the outer clamps. Now that we've loosened the outer clamps, we can go ahead and do the same thing we did before. Break that baby free. From here, I'm going to loosen up the inner clamps again, leaving the outer ones loose, and we're going to work on pulling this baby out of here. Now that all the clamps are loose, we can work on wrestling this plenum out of here. Just like that. Bam, baby. Now we're going to go ahead and remove this boot connector on this end from the plenum. Just careful when you pull it off, there is a vacuum line that runs to it, which I'll show you as soon as we get this off here. So you can see it right here where it pokes through at the end of the screwdriver. So don't forget about that when you're putting this back together. Just going to go ahead and push it through, just like that. Here's the feed for it. And then this is on the left side of the engine, on the driver's side. And then same thing on this right side, just be careful, this one also has a vacuum line going to it in the same spot as the other one. Pull it off, you can see it right here. Just gonna go ahead and push it through. There we go. Same thing, here's the feed for the one on the right side. At this point, we have access to the 2 bolts that hold this oil filler tube in place. You can see ours is already damaged. Someone's used electrical tape to reunite it. So we're going to take this opportunity to replace it, starting by accessing the 2 bolts in the back, removing them, and then getting ready for install. Now, the inner part of the plenum is going to come out the same way the front one did. We're going to undo the 2 inner clamps first, break it free, tighten the inner clamps back up, and then undo the outer clamps, break everything free, and then we'll undo all the clamps and pull this tube out. So without further ado, let's get started. Again, these are going to be a 7mm socket or a Phillips head screwdriver if you can get that in there. We're going to clock these a little better when we go to reinstall them.
Flex that didn't work.
Huh?
The flex ones?
Nah.
Why?
Can't get them in here. Look at the angle.
Nah, you ain't bending them?
No. Okay. There we go. Now we've broken free the part of this rear plenum, we're going to go ahead and tighten back our outer clamps. I'm using the CTA Flex 7mm tool. Makes it a little bit easier to get in here in tight spots. Now I'm going to go ahead and loosen up the 2 outer clamps and repeat the same step. Just careful, there is something connected to the back of this plenum. You don't want to damage it upon spinning it free. Now that we have broken all the hose clamps loose and everything's nice and loose, let's go ahead and loosen up the inner clamps, and then we can work on getting this plenum out. Now, in order to get the rear plenum out, you have to loosen up the bolts on either side of the manifolds. Before we remove the manifold, we're going to go ahead and get this harness out of the way, as well as this power line. So this we're just going to kind of pull off to the side. There is something that holds all of these cables in order. It's just a little plastic clip. I'm going to try to keep it together there just to keep everything organized. And from here, we have our harness that runs through here. I'm going to go ahead. We already cut the zip tie earlier when we were getting one of the manifold bolts out, thinking that maybe this would separate. However, as we can see, it did not. So our next move is going to be to pull up on this. That should be enough to get the manifold out of here. As you can see, we have it routed underneath. Once the manifold is nice and loose, we'll be able to just sneak it out from underneath the harness without having to tug on it too much and risk damaging it. Now we've got the intake manifold bolts loosened, we're going to go ahead and remove the middle plenum. That's going to give us enough room to slide this out. All right. Just like that. Now remember, there's a resonance flap in here, so you don't want to damage the connector going to that. One vacuum line that connects to the back of this. So you're going to want to go ahead and pull that off, and then you can pull this whole plenum piece out. You can see the tip of the vacuum line there. And for a better view, here's where that vacuum line was plugged into. It's a resonance flap right in there. So we're going to restart by taking out as much of the hydraulic fluid in the reservoir tank as possible. I'm using our CTA 7073 syringe. It's an extracting syringe. You can use something similar, or a turkey baster. Just don't use the one from the kitchen. Take this off, set it to the side. I'm just gonna do this a couple times until I get out as much as possible. I'm going to put my cap back on just to avoid letting anything fall into the reservoir. Even though we're going to be removing it, it does not hurt to play it safe. From here, we're going to work on removing this 10mm bolt that holds the bracket to the reservoir onto the manifold. And then we're going to go ahead and rotate this counterclockwise and remove it. Again, this is a 10mm bolt. Just using a socket with an extension. You're going to want to put yourself a couple rags. You want to set yourself some rags down here because this is where the reservoir is going to separate from the pump. And as soon as we remove it, there's going to be a little bit of spillage as we couldn't get all the way down in here. So I'm going to use a couple shop towels, get them neatly in place, and then we'll go ahead and show you how to take this off. Now that we have our towel situated, you want to go ahead and rotate this locking ring counterclockwise, and then we can go ahead and remove our reservoir. So I'm going to try doing it by hand first. This thing probably hasn't been off in its whole life. Give it a little bit of a wiggle. There you go. You can see we have 2 O-rings that help seal the system up. Again, this thing's never been off in its life, so it was tight in there, but giving it a little wiggle or a twist will get it out once you remove your lock ring. From there, you have a little breather hose that just sits in this little clip here that just pops out, and then we can go ahead and remove this in full. Well, now that our shop towels did their job, we can go ahead and remove them. Look at that. I'm going to go ahead and remove a little bit more fluid from our pump neck here. As you can see, it's still at the brim, so if I move the engine even a little bit, it's going to spill out. So I'm just going to take our CTA syringe again. And from there, I'm going to put a towel in here. It's going to soak up some fluid, but it's just going to be to avoid having anything fall into that pump while we have everything apart here. So again, just a little shop towel action. I'd rather have that in there than garbage falling in there. Now that that's taken care of, we can go ahead and remove our junction box over here. We're going to go ahead and start by popping over this positive terminal cap and removing this bolt first so that we can free up this cable. To get this bolt off, it's going to be our nut. It's going to be a 13 millimeter. I'm going to go ahead and thread our 10 mil back in so I have some leverage on this nut, otherwise it's going to keep flexing this bracket. There we go. Go ahead and thread this one off by hand. Again, just a reminder, if you've forgotten, the battery is disconnected. You always want to make sure when you're working with electrical that your battery is disconnected. We've since done this from the beginning of this project, but can't hurt as a quick reminder. That can come off. Now we have a couple 10 millimeters on the right hand side of this positive terminal box that we're going to go ahead and remove. So again, it's just a 10 millimeter nut. From there, that'll free up this, and then we have one more 10 millimeter bracket at the bottom to remove this bracket by itself. All right, so you can see this one is just there to help lock into that open notch section. It doesn't actually have to come all the way off. So I'm going to put my 2 10 mil nuts back on here just so I remember where they go, as well as the one that sits here, as it's not going to be in the way. That way I don't have to worry about labeling anything. Now we've got our junction box freed up, we can go ahead and push these cables out of the way a little bit. So this power cable, it's going to push it back over here, out of the way. Beautiful. This one's going to have to just float around. We can move it more once we get the AC compressor out. So let's go ahead and get started. We have 2 13 millimeter bolts up front. I'm going to use a 13 millimeter socket on a wrench and break these free. These shouldn't be very tight. Their torque values are not that high. You break the other one free first. So as you can see, I was struggling to get this front bolt out. I found there is a 10 millimeter bolt down there that holds the plastic harness that this cable that's in the way is held on by. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it to see if that gives us some more room to get this 15 millimeter bolt out. This would have to come out anyways now that we look at it when the manifold comes out for our oil cooler video, so might as well take it out now. And using a magnet tool, I'm going to fish this bolt out. So as you can see, removing that bolt didn't really help us out. We're going to go ahead and cut the zip tie and see if there's another one underneath the harness. Let me show you the real struggles here, my good people. This isn't all movie magic and ha-has. We struggle too. We're going to go ahead and free up the third bolt in the back. Since we can't really get this front right one out, as we're running into the manifold. So perhaps by freeing up the one in the rear, then we can have some room to wiggle everything around a little bit and get this one out. This that you can see right here in between the runners is supposed to be a temp sensor, and it kind of just sits in the manifold right here. Someone has been in here before, so we'll be sure to put that back in its home when we put it back together. But for now, we're just going to pull it up and off to the side. We're going to try coming back in here with an extension that has a wobble on it. Weeble wobble. We're going to try something a little weird. We have our socket fully seated on the bolt, but then we have our extension barely engaging. That way, if anything's going to slip, it's going to be the extension and not the socket on the bolt. That's in. There we go, baby. Now that we have all three bolts loosened up on our compressor, we were able to get some playroom so that we can get this front bolt that we were struggling with out in the beginning. So we're going to go ahead and pull that out, set it to the side. And then from here, I'm just going to fish out the rear bolt, which you saw a moment ago. Or maybe it's going to come out with the compressor. Let's find out. All right, so you couldn't see a lot of this, but in order to get the compressor forward, what I did was I held the back bolt up and then pulled the compressor out by the top line here, gently of course. Before we go ahead and pull our compressor out of the way, you'll note in between the runner here, we have one connector. This is what triggers our clutch. What we're gonna go ahead and do is disconnect it so that we can pull the compressor out further. Just gonna pull the compressor lead out, just like that. So now we got our AC compressor out. We have it set on this ridge here. We're using a pig mat. It's nice, it's thick, and I left the bolt in obviously because the AC line's in the way of it going out. But it's acting as a stop to keep this from rolling back into the engine bay. In addition, we threw in a zip tie around the strut. It doesn't have any tension on it. It's just as a safety should it fall back into the engine bay or want to fall out and scratch the car. So it's just showing you how we have it set up. If you don't have this here, you might be able to pull it out even more and shove it where the taillight is, but this worked for us. So one of the vacuum lines that runs through the plenums is routed through your first spaced runner, or first and second intake runner on the manifold. So when you pull this out, you can just fish it through and make sure you feed it back through the first two runners. Otherwise, you're gonna pinch it or forget about it when you reinstall. Break them out. On our 996, in order to get the stock or the original oil cooler out, we're gonna need a Allen hex 5mm. So I'm gonna go ahead and break these free, and then we can go ahead and work on removing them. So we'll start with the two on the right. Make sure they're in all the way, you don't wanna strip them. Now we're gonna go ahead and break free the ones on the left-hand side. Before I pull the oil cooler off, I'm gonna go ahead and pull this old line through. You could undo this 10mm bolt, however I think we can sneak this one out. Now I'm pulling it out as one because our new kit comes with a new line. So we're just gonna go ahead and replace that. That comes off like that. And now we can go ahead and pull the oil cooler off. Oh yeah. Now that we have our old oil cooler out, we're gonna work on removing these old seals. As you can see, one already came out. We have 3 left. 2 are for coolant and 2 are for oil themselves. That's how the oil cooler works. So I'm just using a small pick to get these O-rings out. You can see how crushed and flat these are. These are toast. This is ready to leak at any moment. Before we install our new ones, I'm going to go ahead and clean this up a little bit, and then we'll put in our new seals. Now we have our area clean, we're going to go ahead and install our new seals. They're two completely different sizes, so they're pretty impossible to mix up. We're going to go ahead and position our oil cooler on top and put in our new bolts. This is the bottom of the oil cooler. As you can see, it's pretty flat. The seals are what does all the sealing, so there's nothing to channel them onto. You just want to line up your bolt holes properly. The new hardware that comes with our oil cooler kit has Torx head bolts, so you're going to need a T30 to put these in. As you can see, these have no washers. The reason for that is that they're a little bit different in design as compared to the ones that came out. They have a shorter thread, so that means they're going to bite just as well. No need to put washers on them. They're not threading in nicely. Make sure you back out the other ones enough so that you have some play. You can see it basically fell into place once we did that. Now we're going to go ahead and torque these down to 7 foot-pounds. There's one. I'm going to tighten these in a cross pattern, similar to the way you would tighten down like an oil pan. There we go. Now that our oil cooler is bolted in and torqued to spec, we're going to go ahead and put in our new line that comes with our kit. So just as before, I'm going to feed it through the top here. I'm going to go ahead and attach our line to the cooler, and then I'll pull out the slack. Let's work our hose clamp down to a good spot. Bam, baby. Now we're ready to install our intake manifold, but before we do, we're going to go ahead and change the intake manifold gaskets. There's 3 on each manifold. Super simple. You pull the old ones out, and you put the new ones on, or you drop them, one or the other. You'll see the intake manifold gasket has a little notch on it that lines up with the notches on here. Try to do your best to align them perfectly. Now we got our gaskets on, let's go ahead and get this baby back in the car. Now we're ready to install our manifold. A couple of things to remember. This vacuum line has to go between the first and second runner. You know, make sure nothing's gonna be pinched or in the way. If you need to move your harness a little bit to get a better look, you can. However, we got a pretty good spot lined up, so we're gonna grab our hardware and we're gonna thread them all a little bit by hand, and then we'll go ahead and torque them down. However, we got a pretty good spot lined up, so we're going to grab our hardware and we're going to thread them all a little bit by hand, and then we'll go ahead and torque them down. Now we're going to go ahead and install our retaining bracket that holds our wiring harness in place. We're just going to try to slip it underneath. And we're going to take our 10mm bolt, feed it down in, and tighten it back up. If you're going to torque this down, it's going to be about 7 foot-pounds. We're just going to snug it up by hand. Tuck our cables back in, and feed a zip tie through it. Keep it factory fresh. We're gonna make sure our cables are all cleaned up under here. We have our vacuum line sticking out. We're gonna go ahead and get our AC compressor ready for install. Now we're ready to install our AC compressor. Before you do, you wanna make sure this metal bushing is in its place. This is where the third back bolt goes through. Otherwise, the AC compressor won't line up evenly and you'll have a big headache. I'm gonna go ahead and feed the compressor back in. Again, the rear bolt is still in, so you're going to want to hold it up as you put it back into the vehicle. And our further right bolt is also still in. One more thing you want to remember is this plug. This is going to be fed in between the runners, and then we plug it in afterwards. I'm going to feed my top left bolt in, just so I can align the front two bolts. Just give it a couple threads. Still need some play out of it. Now our lower bolt can be started by finger as well. And last but not least, we want to start our third bolt in the back as well to make sure that they're all lining up and threading in properly. You want to make sure to torque these down to 25 Newton meters, or 17.5 foot-pounds, I believe is what it called for. Not much. Now we have our AC compressor in. We got to button up the final last connections up here. If you remember earlier, our temperature sensor wasn't even in its home. If you have a little bit of trouble putting in some rubber grommet like this, a little bit of dielectric grease always helps. It won't degrade the rubber, and it'll just help get it into the slot. I'm just using the tip to spread it. I'm not putting a ton on here, simply spreading it with that. Let's separate this. Try to put the grommet back in by itself. Okay, grommet's back in on its own. Now we're gonna go ahead and put the sensor back in separately. Previous owner or previous person that rents in here did not put this back in, so we feel good about doing it the right way. Another thing you want to remember to connect is your AC clutch switch or AC switch, whatever you want to call it. Just clip right back in. My gloves are slippery from the dielectric grease. I'm gonna tuck this back below with the rest of the harness. And then last but not least, we have our bracket to put back here. Now we're ready to install this retaining bracket again for our junction box. So this goes into the notch down below. I'm just gonna snug it up a little bit so this bracket isn't dancing all over the place. That's good. I'm gonna go ahead and feed our 10 mil back up top. Remember, this is the one I had kept on the manifold. I took it off just before we started filming this. Important to note, this is gonna come off again when we put our power steering reservoir back on. However, I'm just using it so I can line up the holes for this bracket here and not have it dance all over the place on me. These we're just going to tighten down hand tight. If you were to torque them though, you could probably argue they're going to be about 5 foot-pounds. Nice and snug. And we'll get our last cable over here. Get this box open. Slip it on. And put our 13 mil back on. It's going to look like that. Go ahead and close this back up. And now we can get ourselves ready to put our power steering reservoir back in. I'm going to remove this rag, remove this 10 mil, and we'll get it going. This vacuum line goes to the back of the resonance valve. Just like that. We're going to go ahead and feed it all the way through without losing our hose clamps. Sorry, GoPro. It's not personal. Now the tricky part is going to be putting the plenum on and making sure we have no leaks on either side. Something like that, my good people. If you're lucky, it'll basically self-install itself. Let's go ahead and get these hose clamps adjusted, and we can go ahead and leave them ready for tightening. Now that we have our rear plenum in, we're going to go ahead and leave the hose clamps loose until the manifold's fully bolted on. From there, we're going to go ahead and sneak on our first plenum. You want to remember that these little boot connectors have a port in them for the vacuum line, so you want to make sure you route both vacuum lines into each boot connector. It looks something like that. And then these came in pretty far through, something like that. And then let's do the same for the left. Here's our left one, same deal, has a port in there for the vacuum line. So let's get that one situated. Right through the hole. I'm gonna go ahead and slap this one on as well. You'll see the vacuum line almost acts as a stopper for how far it goes in. And then from there, we're gonna go ahead and slip on the front plenum as well. Here's our plenum. Again, you wanna make sure your connector for your breather hose is on the same side that the breather hose is on, AKA the left side of the vehicle. So we're just gonna go ahead and same thing, loosely slip it on, leaving the hose clamps till the very end. Just something like that. Once we get the manifold bolted down, we'll go ahead and adjust our boots on the ends, make sure that everything's nice and tight, and tighten down the clamp. Now, if you remember, we went ahead and just left these plenums on loosely. That way we can put in the manifold and adjust as needed. Now that the manifolds are both bolted down, we can go ahead and tighten them down. I'm routing the clamps up here so that if I have to get back in here again, I can. It'll make life easier to get to them in the future. Again, these are a 7mm if you're using a socket, or you can use a Phillips head or a flathead screwdriver. Either or will work just fine. Now we're ready to install our reservoir back in. You can see on the receiving end, there is 4 arrows. Kind of looks like the buttons on a Nintendo controller. The reservoir has those same arrows on it that are going to key it into place. Then we're going to go ahead and rotate our locking collar. And it feels seated. It's not really going to have a lot of room to spin. From there, you're going to want to rotate this collar back up until it lines up with the notch right here on the receiving end of the pump. So you can see that was not all the way in, so don't do that. If you're unsure, give it a tug and make sure it's fully seated in. We can line up our brackets here and put our 10mm back in. 10mm bolt back in. Nice and snug. Then we can put our bleeder hose or breather hose back in its little clip. Just like that, just a breather line. Just for good measure, one last pull, nice and secure. We're gonna go ahead and mount the throttle body. I'm gonna start with this top left one up here. Just gonna thread it in by hand. Next, we're gonna do the bottom left bolt. Next, we're gonna do the top right. And now our bottom right. Now I'm going to go around on all 4 corners and tighten it down evenly. If you're going to torque these down, again, these are small bolts going into a plastic housing, no more than 5 to 7 foot-pounds. And then last, we have our bottom 10 mil nut. This is just a nut that's on a rubber bushing. Doesn't have to be very tight. You don't want to rip the bushing either. Just snug that down. If you remember, we had 2 plugs going to the throttle body. One's going to go here at the bottom. Probably would have been easier if you plugged these in first, but we didn't think of that. There's one. And then we have the second one in the back. This one was the more tricky one to get to when it was in, but nonetheless, we got it here. You okay? And there's 2. Now we have our throttle cable to hook up. I'm just going to pull it out, actuate the throttle all the way back, feed the head in. If it's not coming down all the way like it should, then go ahead and play with the throttle cable in the back. Maybe you need to align it a little bit better. There we go. Now we can install our new 18mm nut. And then we're going to torque it down to 63 foot-pounds. Now we're going to go ahead and repeat the same on the other side. Now that we've snugged this side down, we're going to go ahead and torque it down to 63 foot-pounds. Now we can feed our new belt in. I'm going to work my way from the water pump up, as this one's going to be the sneakiest to get on. Now I have the belt almost lined up for the most part. Because it's easier to reach up here, I'm going to pull it off this top roller. And put it on everywhere else. Reaching underneath the car to get to this water pump pulley. I'm going to give it a quick tug. Make sure it looks good on all the pulleys. And now we're going to put our 24 mil back on the tensioner and try to slip the belt on. This is a new belt, so it's not going to be as stretchy as the old one. Might be a little bit tighter to get this one on. Just like that. Now we can put our airbox back on and wrap up this job. Now we're going to put our airbox back in. On the bottom, you'll see there's supposed to be 2 allocating dowels. Ours is missing one, so we're going to go ahead and make sure the one on the right finds its way in. We're going to go ahead and slip it in. As we do that, we're going to run our mass airflow sensor wire through that clip on the corner. There we go. And we can go ahead and line up our airbox. Make sure we get that dowel in its home down below. There we go. We can slip our intake boot on. Now we're going to reinstall our 13mm bolt that holds the box into place. There we go. Oil filler tube can be popped back into its home. I'm using an 8mm socket, however you can just use a flathead. And we can pop our air tube back in. Just like that. And then last but not least, reconnect our mass airflow sensor. There we have it. Now that the motor's bolted back up into place, we can go ahead and remove our floor jack, lowering it slowly just for precaution. Pull it out of the way. And there you have it, my good people. Another DIY in the books. Overall, this oil cooler job was a little daunting in the sense that we had to get into the right side of the engine, pull out our manifold. You will remember after watching this that we had both manifolds out. That is not a required step. We were doing a couple videos at the same time, so we had both plenums out. However, for this job, the right manifold is all you need to take out. The plenum's in the middle, and you should have more than enough room to get to the oil cooler and the AC compressor. Don't forget about that sneaky bolt in the back. If you guys like what you saw in this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave those in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like it, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. What's left? Belt replacement. Oh no, that was, oh yeah.